The best thing that can happen to you is a slight bone wound, Wolf said. He was standing under the awning of the tent I shared with Wrestler and Stoddard. A bone wound. The words make me sick to my stomach, I said. I mean, if you're going to get shot, then so be it. A bone wound will get you out of this fucking country. Deacon strode between the rows of tents. Let's go, he yelled. Let's do without the injuries, I said. Maybe the war would just end. I reached for my helmet, my gun already dangling over my body armor. I was ready. Like hell you are, Wolf replied. Good luck. Gary climbed out of the tent and headed for his helicopter. We couldn't fly together as prospectors simply because junior warriors weren't allowed to. We felt safer together. Especially after the pilot who came to replace me in the cavalry, Ron Fox, got shot while sitting in the cockpit with Gary. The bullet went from bottom to top through his chin. Gary said that the poor guy's brains leaked out as his helmet was pulled off. Fox's death was one of the reasons Gary was put on leave before transferring to Prospector Company. He and I had been working hard to get Deacon to let us fly together, telling him what a great bunch we'd been in the cavalry, but he wouldn't budge. Good luck, I said. I got out of the tent and walked with Wolf for a while. What do you get for a scratch? I asked. A free cup of coffee. What do you want? You have to get hurt so that you can spend a lot of time on treatment, but you don't have to be disabled for the rest of your life. Yeah, I get it. All right, let's get to work. I saw the Sky King waiting for me outside the operations tent. I'll see you after the flight. Good luck. Yeah, Wolf saluted. The King of Heaven smiled. Wow, I got lucky today. Flying with a veteran. I'm just like, safe or something. Yeah, stop, please. No, I mean it. I feel like I'm going to be okay sitting in the cockpit with you. We walked to our chopper, a couple of pilots in a long, disjointed line of helicopter crews walking through the red dust to their vehicles. Sir, you can be a real pain in the ass sometimes. Huh, bellowed the King of the Sky. Roger that. We walked over to the helicopter. Look, Mason, I like you. To get you to trust me, I'm going to let you in on a lucrative little deal. I'll tell you all about it on the way back. Thank you. Aha. I mean it. You're going to love it, you'll see. One of the differences between the prospectors and the cavalry, aside from that informal relationship between officers and warriors, was that the prospectors literally bathed in breast armor. There was so much of it that they even caulked the excess with window drops. The sight of that armor at my feet made me feel guilty. The lack of it had gotten Morris killed. Maybe there's another pilot flying around Vietnam somewhere right now who can't figure out why the fuck he doesn't have armor. Maybe he's getting shot at right now. Where'd you get all this stuff? I pointed to the armor. We've always had them, the Sky King replied. He looked at me as if I had said something stupid. Why? Just curious. The weather was perfect, with fluffy white clouds trailing across a bright blue sky, a perfect day for flying. Since I had been here before, I knew there were no Viet Cong around. I felt I was done with the hot battles by leaving the cavalry. The only thing that bothered me were the soldiers of the Republic of Vietnam. Sad stories continued to circulate about their reputation. One of the prospectors told me that some Republic of Vietnam soldier turned around and started shooting at his helicopter after landing in an area. I had heard of this before. We picked up 8 Republic of Vietnam Rangers. Their camouflage uniforms fit them very tightly. They looked around nervously, smoking cigarettes and taking their time to climb aboard. They could not change my poor opinion of our allies. 12 slicks were to take Republic of Vietnam soldiers a few miles from Dak to the highlands. We were to cross the eastern ridge and land 2 helicopters at a time on an 8-foot wide pad that led to a small concrete fortress. As the formation stretched out, taking the proper formation, we heard over the comms that the Viet Cong were also in place. A couple miles from the area, I saw a chain of phantoms strafing a hill across a small valley near the fortress. The Sky King and the first were in the second pair of helicopters to land. When the first 2 landed, They immediately reported hits.tracers, whipped at the Phantoms from several machine gun positions on the face of the hill. The fighters were spinning in the air, firing murderous bursts from their guns during sharp maneuvers. I was in control, sitting in the right seat of the car. Our paired helicopter had managed to pick a spot just in front of the fortress, leaving us a bare ridge right next to the Viet Cong firing positions. I began to approach for landing. The two helicopters in front of us took off, staying on the ground for so long it seemed like an eternity. About 100 yards before landing, our starboard gunner fired a line in response to several muzzle flashes. At the same moment, black smoke billowed from the very crest of a neighboring Phantom. It gained altitude sharply, almost vertically, and we saw the pilot eject. When we landed, I saw bullets that were scraping the ground right in front of us on an oblique trajectory. The enemy position was just above our level. The starboard gunner was firing back, while I waited for the Republic of Vietnam soldiers to deign to get the fuck out of the helicopter. It seemed like an hour had passed, but the flight mechanic still hadn't yelled that everyone had disembarked. I looked back and saw him trying to shove a Vietnamese soldier out the door, right from his awkward position near the door. The other Vietnamese soldiers ducked at the sound of gunfire and looked at me with rounded eyes, as if expecting me to get them out of there. I shook my head and started yelling, "Get out! Get out!" pointing to the door. They were sitting inside. I heard a bullet hit the hull of the helicopter. A good old-fashioned thump. The flight mechanic drew his pistol, pointed it at the soldiers, and started pushing them toward the door with a murderous stare. When they realized I wasn't going anywhere, and the flight mechanic could actually shoot them, they started climbing out. I looked up at the fortress, expecting to see some fire cover. There wasn't any. The guns were silent, all lying behind the walls, tucked into the ground. The smoking black trail of the Phantom dissolved into the jungle. The pearly white parachute blossomed into the blue sky. Our paired helicopter took off. "Out," yelled the mechanic. I glanced through the bay door at the Vietnamese soldiers hiding behind the low edge of the mountain range. I took off. As we flew in front of the fortress, we saw the defenders lying on the ground. Not a single machine gun was raised. After half a mile, it got quieter. That was it, one landing on a mountain ridge. The remaining 5 miles to the camp I flew, fuming with rage. That's the first time I've ever seen that. How the fuck are they going to win this bastard war if they're doing this? The Sky King nodded grimly and remained silent. He had faced the Republic of Vietnam soldiers before. When we landed, I thanked Blakely, our flight mechanic, for turning on his head in time to help kick the Vietnamese soldiers out. "No problem, sir. It'll be even faster next time," he smiled. We circled the helicopter looking for hits. Only one bullet. It was hard to believe that they had shot down the Phantom and missed us while we were standing on top, but that's how it worked out. "Lucky. Lucky. Lucky. Lucky," said the Sky King. "No words," I replied. We reached the staff tent and waited for the rest of the formation to return. "Wolf got hit," Major Richard Raymond, the staff officer, said as we went inside. "Your comrade, I believe." He looked at me. "Yes, sir. A classmate. His whole arm's been blown off. He'll be here soon," he shook his head. The day had gotten off to a bad start. I could still see the Vietnamese soldiers with their asses stuck to the floor of my helicopter. "Daring's guys are trying to clean out that machine gun position," Raymond went on. "Also, our Slick, along with a combat chopper, went after an Air Force pilot." "Just one?" "Yeah, your friend Resler picked him up. The other pilot didn't make it out. Poor guy." The two Hueys flew quickly at low altitude over the landing strip. When they landed, a staggering Wolf climbed out of one, supported by a flight mechanic. He was clutching his hand to his chest, blood dripping directly onto his pants. Doc Da Vinci met them halfway and escorted them to the tent. Wolf was pale, as if all the blood had drained from his arm. He smiled weakly at me as Doc cut his sleeve with scissors. "The bastards shot my smokes," Wolf exclaimed. His hand slid down and we saw that the vest pocket had been torn clean off, revealing a ceramic plate behind the green fabric. The bullet had gone through his right forearm and into the vest pocket. "You see that?" "The bastards ripped out my cigarettes." I nodded and handed him a lit cigarette. "Can you move your fingers?" Doc asked. Sure. Wolf let out a puff of smoke. "Well, wiggle them." "I am." Doc looked at Wolf. "I'm afraid you're going to have to go home after this." "Mason, I told you. A wound to the bone always works." I smiled, strained. "You've got it all figured out." While Doc wrapped Wolf's arm in bandages, the Sky King and the first went to the strip to get the helicopter ready. We were to take the wounded man to Pleiku. During the flight, Wolf smoked cigarettes one after another, which he was supplied with by the flight mechanic. When we reached the hospital in Pleiku, he turned pink and smiled like a lucky lottery winner. On disembarkation, he landed right after me on the same mountain ridge. I almost wished I had been there instead of him. That same day, a little later, King of the Skies and I took a squad of grunts from the 101st to help the Republic of Vietnam soldiers, and then came back to pick them up. On our second landing approach, we came under fairly heavy fire, but escaped without being hit. Parallel to us, Daring's combat platoon was thrashing around the hill, trying to knock out machine gun positions. No one believed that the Gooks could survive a bombardment of Phantoms and an attack by an entire platoon of attack helicopters, but they succeeded. As the sun fell behind the mountain range, the attack helicopters began to return one by one. They grabbed a lot of bullets. The 2 wounded pilots were immediately taken to Pleiku. "Where the hell is 702? Major Raymond's question hung in the air. We gathered in the operations tent and listened to the communication channels. The 702nd was the last in the line of attack helicopters. 5 minutes ago, it reported a hit, and then it went quiet. "So, let's get someone to fly out to reconnoiter," said Feather, standing near the door. "Maybe the pilot forgot the way to the camp." He frowned at his own joke. Suddenly we heard the familiar slap of blades, and the helicopter appeared in the twilight, sliding sharply on its skids over the dusty ground and hitting the landing strip. It landed softly, someone joked. Everyone exhaled with relief and began to scatter around. When I got out of the tent, I froze with a few other guys, because something strange was going on with the 702. No one was getting out of the vehicle. The helicopter was just standing there making engine noise. The blades were spinning lazily. Someone ran up to the cockpit and started waving his arms frantically, beckoning Doc over. All 4 crewmen were unconscious from their injuries. As the crew of the 702 was loaded onto the slick to Pleiku, I returned to my tent. Stoddard was showing Ressler a 6-foot piece of Huey, the tail rotor drive shaft tube. As I got closer, I discerned a bullet hole in the pipe. "First hit on me," Stoddard announced proudly. Ressler nodded. Stupi had come under fire that morning and had borrowed a ridiculous trophy from the flight engineer. "I'll take this thing home," Stupi said. I felt a slight prick of conscience for thinking Stupi was a moron. He was just 2. Carefree, I guess. "You're an asshole," Ressler said. I laughed for a long time. "I'll tell you the story the Sky King began as we sat in the dining room." "Ice." "What do you mean?" Ice." Buddy King Sky's eyes glittered in the light of the light bulb above the table. "Our ice maker was lurching and growling in a pit 50 feet away." "Is this the lucrative business you were talking about?" "Exactly, Kemo-sab. Ring has already agreed. We take a chopper, drive it to Kontum every day and fill it to the top with ice. Big cubes of ice. We bring them down here and sell them to our own mess hall, the company beer hall, and then we unload the rest to the grunts in the 101st. We'll charge them double for the ice." "How's that? The prospectors get free ice. We got an ice machine." "Yeah, but it makes ice chips. It's barely enough for a drink. I'm telling you about the big 20-pound cubes of ice to cool the beer. We can put the profits into the officer's home." "What do you say? What do you want me to do?" I asked. Ask to join my crew every day. That's all. That's easy. Why not? That's what I'm thinking, partner. We couldn't land the Huey in the center of Quantum to pick up ice. King Sky arranged for a truck from a nearby SWAT camp. The arrangement was that we could use their truck with a driver, and they could use our Huey with a pilot. On the first day of ice business, King Sky drove the truck into town, and I took the SWAT commander, a lieutenant named Bricklin, on a jungle patrol. We travelled at low altitude over the bush and jungle in 20 minutes. The same walk on our own 2 feet took him and his Chinese mercenaries a full day. Naturally, he could see practically nothing from the fast-flying helicopter at least, nothing that he could have seen on foot, but he could honestly report to his superiors about the complete route. He and his subordinates were simply happy. Only 15 or 20 men in this camp were Americans. The rest were Chinese mercenaries from Saigon. When we got back to the camp, Bricklin showed me the layout of the area and explained that the Chinese lived on one half and the Americans on the other. Bricklin was a tall, gaunt Montana native. Like most special forces, he held old-school views on the proper way to conduct this war. To him, the Charlies were something of a collection of vicious, lawless men who had no chance whatsoever of seizing power. In Bricklin's opinion, American domination of the Quantum area would sooner or later force the locals to trust and adopt the American way of life, given that the Americans were educating their children, providing medical services and other material goods to which even the most dormant hillbillies were already accustomed. Bricklin began to list the advantages of the patient method of drawing the Vietnamese to the American side over the so-called war of attrition, when suddenly he saw a cavalry patch with a horse's head on my right shoulder. The problem with the cavalry guys is that they overcropped a bunch of people who just got in their way. Bricklin began. The Viet Cong guys hyped up the tragedy after every peasant or buffalo killed. "See how much the Americans love you," they asked. They killed old Mrs. Coa yesterday, and she was 75. She never hurt a fly in her whole life. Clearly the Charlies themselves had time to visit the same village and execute all the commanders. But who believes politicians? The capital raids that the cavalry and other units are making are destroying everything these people have. Yes, they are putting the heat on the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units, but they don't realize they are going over the heads of the people we are trying to help. And all these relocations are tantamount to death for the local villagers. These people are born, grow up and die in the same villages, the villages of their ancestors. Their native village means everything to them. And what do? We march our troops through these villages, burn them to the ground to drive out the Viet Cong, transport the peasants God knows where, overnight turning them into refugees, dependents, and unabashedly hateful Americans. The Viet Cong are winning because we're losing. Bricklin had time to say all this before he even opened a can of beer in the small tin walled building the SWAT team called their officers' home. They need to set an example. Show the Viet Cong what the American way of life is, and they'll change their minds. These guys will follow us. Bricklin and I were sitting at a folding table in a small bar. I was drinking coffee, he was drinking beer. I had a flight to catch. Their camp was completely carefree. Even the slot machine left no chance of defeat. The cover of the machine was removed, all the gears, wheels and the box of change were in plain sight. The money lost could be retrieved from the back of the machine. Bricklin's philosophy led me to speculate about politics, I asked. Look, that's a whole other question. We're here, that's a fact. In my opinion, that's the main question. Maybe you're right, but stopping the process is harder than starting it. I think we're going to be here a long time. Do you think we'll win? Not if we keep tearing up villages and killing the people we're trying to save. A lot of people say that if we had let the Vietnamese hold elections, they would have voted for Ho Chi Minh, and the war wouldn't have happened. Bricklin nodded. Yeah, I read about that too. Maybe that's the case. But like I said, we're here, and that's a fact. Why not just pull the troops out? Does Lyndon Johnson look like he's ready to lay down his arms? No. Exactly. Bricklin smiled. The ice truck rolled into the gate and stopped near the bar. The King of Heaven jumped out, swinging open the mesh door. "I'll tell you what the prices are." He sat down beside me. "Assholes ask $2.50 for a 50-pound cube. The same cube costs 75 cents in Phan Rang." "That's because the cavalry was here a month ago," Bricklin explained. "Those guys would pay whatever price they were told, and not even haggle. They just don't understand the local mentality." He winked at me. The King of Heaven took a beer and struck up a conversation with Bricklin. He informed him that it was a done deal, and if the lieutenant didn't mind, we'd be flying in every day. "Make yourself at home," Bricklin replied. "And come on the Huey." We headed for the helicopter as soon as we loaded the last cube aboard. There were 20 cubes in all, 1,000 pounds of ice that were melting inside the cargo hold. I started up. I couldn't fly over the fence because of the overload, so I had to turn the car around and take off on a landing trajectory. As we climbed toward the highlands on the 30-mile-long route to Dak-2, the King of the Sky smoked cigarettes, chatted about business, and glanced nervously at the cargo, which was melting in the warm wind. "Hell, if we get half the ice, we're lucky," he said. "Should we close the doors?" he asked the flight engineer. "Sir, if we do that, we won't be able to get behind the machine guns," he said. "That's right," he turned to me. "Next time we'll put tarps around these things." He looked at the load again. "God damn it, look how it's melting. Every drop is worth a fucking dime." "Almost there." "Thank God. I'd hate to come back to the company with a puddle worth $50. The ring would have killed me on the spot." He laughed. I landed on the strip, choosing a parking lot closer to the mess hall. A truck rolled up to us, and the crew started unloading ice while I jammed the car. The ice was then taken to one of our tents, where it fell under a complex distribution system that allowed the ice to be delivered to our company, neighbouring mechanics, and the 101st before dark. The ice business gave me a chance to barter for the material I used to build the bunker. Gary and I were greatly afraid of getting hit by mortar fire. The prospectors thought we were being too cautious. Their camp had never been shelled. We enlisted Stoddard to help us. He was a tireless digger. In one day we built a 4x4, 6-foot-deep trench, with Stoopy digging most of it. While Gary and Stoopy were filling sandbags for the bunker walls, I took the jeep to the mechanic's shop and struck a deal with the local captain. He gave me 3 sheets of perforated steel sheeting for 1 cube of ice. I picked up the steel sheets in advance and drove them to the bunker. On top of the sheets we laid 3 layers of sandbags. The probability that our shelter would withstand a direct hit was extremely small, but it still existed, and that reassured us. Meanwhile, the prospectors were laughing at us. But we knew what was what. That night Gary and I sat in the bunker and talked quietly about homecoming. We were both already demobiles with less than 70 days left to serve. They say that in the last month, demobes are no longer sent on combat missions. Gary was sipping his Budweiser on duty. "I've heard that. It's ideal to take a vacation 10 days before you come back, and you don't have to fight. Deliver rice and junk to the rear of Phan Rang." "Can you do that?" "Yeah, sure, we could take a vacation together. I know some great places in Taipei. I hear Hong Kong's more interesting." "Really?" "Okay, Hong Kong's fine too. I've never been there." "So you're going there on vacation?" For the first week, we drove grunts from the 101st to positions at the north end of the valley. They exchanged fire with the enemy, but no major engagements. We also took up an artillery position on the foothills, positioning it so as to control the semicircle the 101st was sweeping. Intelligence had reported earlier that there was at least 1 battalion of North Vietnamese soldiers in the area, and the 101st dreamed of fighting it. I was scheduled to have some free time in the afternoon each day, so I continued to race for ice. After a few days, the King of the Skies and I worked out a scheme where whoever stayed with Bricklin could drink, and whoever went for ice on the truck kept a dry law, so that there would be at least 1 sober pilot left for the return trip. These daily flights became even more enjoyable. I was almost enjoying being a prospector. They were oddballs, but they got the job done, and did it with fire. With the exception of the 6 losses we suffered on the very first day, everyone was alive and well, and that made me happy. The prospectors seemed to be doing all right. When there was a lull in the fighting, the company reigned cheerful. But as it turned out the next day, we had managed to get very detached from the outside world. Almost everyone was in camp when a Chinook flew to us from Saigon. Ring walked out to the helicopter to give his hand to the 4 Red Cross girls who were climbing out of the rear hatch. Deacon joined him, and they led the girls toward us. I sat on my bunk watching the procession. As I looked around, I noticed that everyone had disappeared somewhere. The whole camp had suddenly turned into a ghost town. Gary looked outside, announced that the donut dolls had arrived but stayed in the tent. Ring led the girls along the entire company street, apparently trying to introduce them to at least one person, but everyone was gone. The girls were obviously nervous, peering inside the dark tents, where silent faces, hidden by shadows, occasionally looked at them. The girls walked past twice. Ring and Deacon escorted them back to the Chinook. During this time, the Chinook crew had time to unload a pile of cardboard boxes onto the landing strip. We watched Feather, who nodded as he listened to someone else's explanation. The worried girls shook hands with Featherstone, looked puzzled once more in the direction of the deserted camp, and settled back into the helicopter. As the helicopter flew away to a safe distance, the prospectors climbed back out as if nothing had happened. Why did they hide? I asked Gary, "Why did you hide?" "I don't know. I just couldn't get out to them. I don't think we realized we'd lost our minds. They're white. All they talk about is wanting a white woman. But when a white woman shows up 5 minutes ago, they all go into hiding." Humanitarian aid Deacon pointed to the boxes. "What's that?" "Free shit from the Red Cross." We went over to the boxes and grabbed gifts like soap, combs, toothpaste, and packs of cigarettes. We all looked guilty. The girls had come with gifts and we had rejected them. The King of Heaven jumped out onto the landing strip and folded his arms. "Come back!" he shouted. "Come back!" I looked inside at the sagging top of my mosquito net. Ressler sat in the light writing letters. Lying on my back, I thought I should move my electric razor and the other junk I kept on the net. It was sagging too much. Stoopy burrowed under the blankets and slept. The mountainous terrain was happy to be cool at night. Gary turned off the flashlight, and for a while I could hear him stirring in the bunk, tucking the mosquito netting under the blankets. Then there was silence. From far away came the occasional sounds of battle. The 101st was gaining momentum day by day. I couldn't sleep. I stared into the darkness and thought about the moment when the combat sorties would be over. Gary and I had requested a leave of absence that would start in 2 weeks. If all went according to plan, we would only have a month left to serve after our leave. A burst of artillery sounded in the distance. I tensed up. For almost a year now I had been listening to those sounds, and I could instantly tell the difference between an incoming shell and an outgoing shell, even when I slept right next to artillery or mortar positions. The noise that came from the northern part of the valley sounded somehow ominous. An electric shaver flickered above me. I was gripped by terror. A landmine? The sparks grew into a white flash. 4th of July fireworks level brightness suddenly morphed into blinding white flames. I rolled from my bunk to the floor and jumped up. Shadows flickered across the walls of the tent from the bright light. It was brighter than daylight inside. Gary. "Fire!" I shouted, my back against the tent's stretching tent outside. The blinding flames flickered a green hue through the tent tarp. When Gary asked what was wrong, the lights went out. I was shivering in just my underwear, covered in sweat. Gary came over to me. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Didn't you see the fire?" "What fire?" "In the tent." "My razor caught fire. You didn't see it?" "I didn't see anything." "Come on, I'll show you." I stepped gingerly into the tent. Stoddard wasn't even awake. I took Gary's flashlight and pointed it at the mosquito netting. My razor lay unharmed. I gingerly touched it, then took it in my hand. It was cold. How was that possible? It burned like a flash of magnesium. I saw it. Bob, nothing burned. I'm still getting goosebumps. Everybody's got their flies in their eyes. No, they explain everything. The razor was on fire. I stopped talking as soon as I realized what I was saying. It was the clearest vision of my life, but now I was standing with Gary in the tent, holding the razor. It wasn't burning or flickering or blinding me, at least no one else saw it. I approached Da Vinci, who was standing outside the bunker. I recounted my vision to him exactly, with all the details. He nodded as I spoke. Here. He held out a small pill to me. What's this? It'll help you sleep. I'll give you more tomorrow night. Try to calm down. I am calm. Or was. Try it. Try it. The next night we saw the sky over the northern part of the valley filled with tracer tongues of flame being shot by the puff. North Vietnamese soldiers were attacking our artillery positions. 4 helicopters from Daring's combat platoon were in the middle of the action, flying back and forth near an artillery installation that was being attacked by the enemy. The North Vietnamese soldiers decided to focus on this particular gun out of the other 4. Puffer Douglas DC-3 with a Gatling machine gun cut the black sky with tongues of continuous flame, its flares illuminating it with white flashes, sparkling and swaying over the battle zone. The North Vietnamese soldiers continued to advance. The gun barrel lowered for direct fire. One of the attack helicopter pilots told us that, as the North Vietnamese soldiers crowded into the firing position, they became so intermingled with the American soldiers that the aerial fire had to be stopped. The position was overrun. We were on alert all night. By 3 o'clock in the morning we still hadn't been sent on a sortie and I went to bed. One little magic pill and I passed out. At dawn the next morning, the 101st reclaimed the firing position back, thanks in large part to the support of attack helicopters. Capt. John Niven showed up at my door early that morning and informed me that it was time for us to take off. We were to try to get some ammunition to the surrounded troops. Niven stated without rancour that I was a better flyer than he was. Being the crew commander, he took care of the communications and I was in charge. Our first stop was the company base area at Camp 101st, which was surrounded by the enemy. We landed in the base area to get exact coordinates and wait. The company was under fire. There was no way to get close to it. We shut down the vehicle near a small firing range within a mined and barbed wire perimeter and waited. By noon, we were still waiting. We could hear the company commander, Delta 6, reporting over the comms from a neighbouring tent. He had 7 fighters, left 38 soldiers, either dead or wounded. He grimly relayed to the base the names of the men who were already definitely confirmed dead, and repeated, "It's too hot to send a chopper down there. We may have to wait until dark." Having heard enough of this talk, I reached the tent and got a case of .45 caliber ammunition from the sergeant. I had brought 500 rounds to the range and intended to kill the rest of the day by firing hundreds of bullets at beer cans. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, even I was impressed with my marksmanship. I was consistently hitting beer cans from 100 yards. By 4 o'clock, a few grunts joined me, and I even took a couple shots with a courtesy M16. Another pawn asked to try his luck with an M79 grenade launcher. The more I shot, the more I calmed down. I realized that I just needed this. Shoot somewhere, at anything. Niven came out of the tent as I once again started shooting at the cans. "Let's try to fly," he said. I put my gun in my shoulder holster and headed for the helicopter. "I'm going to try to take off," Niven said. "I need to practice." "Sure, don't be shy." The 2 grunts climbed aboard, loading the compartment with ammunition boxes. Niven started the engine, checked the steaming power, and made sure we had enough. He lowered the nose of the helicopter, a little lower than it should have been, and climbed over the barbed wire. Unfortunately, the machine was overloaded for the given takeoff angle, so the helicopter was unable to gain altitude. We felt a pull backwards when we were over the minefield. I looked out the window and saw a barbed wire that had snagged on a slide and was pulling back to another wire. "We've snagged the wire," I yelled. From my yell, he immediately realized what was wrong and went back down. Then he did something completely unexpected to me. Instead of staying hovering over the minefield and reversing, he landed the car on the ground. I jumped up in my seat, slamming my shoulders into the harness and bracing myself for the explosion. Niven had forgotten about the perimeter being booby-trapped. He remembered it as soon as we touched the ground. I glanced at him as the car shifted into low gear. The sun was shining through the plexiglas. Sweat was dripping down his face. His frightened look matched my sensations. There was no explosion. The grunts ordered him to hold still. The sappers, who knew the layout of the mines, gracefully approached us with wire cutters and released us. Niven was shaking, so it was up to me to fly. When we reached the surrounded company, we saw the attack helicopters that were shelling the face of the hill. Their efforts were negated by the extremely dense and thick foliage. As a matter of fact, the company itself was hiding under a forest cover 75 feet high. "Too dangerous, Prospector. Wait for darkness," Delta 6 said. "Roger," that Niven replied. We turned back, frustrated. The tension had reached its limit. During the approach, I'd been looking at the area and hadn't seen any safe routes. The company was stuck on a low hill covered with trees and surrounded by high ground. If the North Vietnamese soldiers weren't going nowhere by the time we returned, we would be an easy target. I landed near the company base and shut down the car. It was 2 hours until dark. We grabbed a bite to eat and waited. As we took off, the sky was moonless and very dark. After flying for about 10 minutes toward the mountains, I turned off the parking lights and began to descend. As we dived down, the tops of the mountains, darker than the sky, rose above us. I oriented myself by the outline of the valley and hills that I had managed to memorize from 2 weeks of flying in this area. The outlines of the land can be seen from low altitude, even on the darkest night. Even on a moonless night, even when the sky is cloudy, you can always find landmarks to recreate the outline. I had learned not to stare at the right objects, but to capture them with my sidevision.so as I slowly moved toward the hillside. I knew that the treetops must be brighter than the top of the hill behind them. Delta 6 reported that by all indications we were on course. I picked the right shadow. "You're close," Delta 6 said. "Keep going. Slow down." As the car went from flying to hovering, the overload became obvious. The dim instrument lights showed that I was hovering at maximum power. We sailed forward, 6 feet above the trees, following Delta 6's instructions. Delta 6 reported. "We hear gunshots." I saw muzzle flashes on the hill directly in front of us. "I think it's just to the right. Stop. I can hear you right above us, but I can't see you. We've got wounded all over the place. Don't want you to hit them with ammo crates." I hovered, trying to spread my gaze and follow only shades of black. Muzzle flashes blinked across the hillside. An under-rate warning siren went off. I glanced at the gauge and saw the arrow dropping rapidly. The car was sinking into the trees. "If we don't drop the crates, we're going down." "We've got to drop the ammo," Niven said. "No, you're right on top of the wounded." In the background of the Delta 6 canal, the crackle of rifles could be heard. "Do we or do we not drop the fucking ammo?" "I've moved to the right." The flight mechanic and the grunts had the boxes ready at the edge of the compartment, but there was nowhere to drop them. The top of a tree grew in front of us, hitting the nose of the helicopter. "We're here. If we don't add power, we'll join the guys below in pieces." The shaking Huey resisted as I tried to move forward. The siren continued to yell. The engine was on the verge of failure. Moving forward required tremendous effort. I heard a loud pop, the blades cutting down the top of a tree. I couldn't gain altitude. To do so, I had to descend and regain propeller speed. I turned right, released some power by this maneuver, and dragged the skids over the treetops. After a few feet, I was able to descend over the hillside and dive into the Black Gorge. "What now?" Niven asked. I'll fly to the end of the gorge, turn around and try again. We're overloaded. Yes, but now I have an idea of where we need to land. Niven contacted Delta 6. Thank you, I could hear the appreciation in his voice. As I slowly made my way back to the hillside, the muzzle flashes came back to life. Tongues of tracers flashed across the port side. Apparently we were hard to see, since we had not yet been hit. During the negotiations on the first attempt, I intuitively knew where Delta 6 was and where we should drop the crates. Right here, he yelled. Pull over. I stopped the car. We pulled down into the trees, and Delta 6 gave the drop order. The crates came flying out of the cargo bay with a crash and a snap. They fell from 75 feet through branches and leaves. With the weight gone, the machine picked up power. Good job, yelled Delta 6. No one was hurt. Good job. Thanks, Prospector. I knocked down another treetop on the way back, ducked into the side of the gorge, and sped off. 10 minutes later, we were already sitting at the base listening to the praise for saving soldiers' lives. Delta 6 and his guys had dropped off the last of their ammo, providing us with cover. The next morning, Delta 6 Company was able to push the North Vietnamese soldiers back, or they pushed back themselves, after which a Chinook flew in and picked up the wounded. Another Chinook was picking up a bunch of survivors along with the bodies of the dead. Unfortunately, the enemy had the advantage of territory. In some of the landing zones that the grunts had carved out on hilltops, the stumps stood so tightly together that it was extremely difficult to get skids between them. American patrols cut through the thickets, giving their best only to get hopelessly lost. Commanders were constantly reporting missing soldiers who were actually lost in the jungle. One could get lost there by moving 10 feet away. While the fighting was going on in the jungle, North Vietnamese soldiers were successfully crowding, attacking, and even defeating our units. When platoons and companies were hit by a major offensive, rescue squads were sent to their aid, lost, scattered, and similarly encircled. In a matter of days, the 101st lost several detachments sent out to find those lost. Complete confusion reigned, and in this confusion people were dying. Under such conditions, our helicopters could do nothing to help the grunts. We were constantly trying to find soldiers who were calling for help over the phone from the impenetrable jungle. One company was completely wiped out while we were flying over the forest trying to spot them. Communication with them broke down and the company was gone. Another company, led by Bud Carpenter, a soccer player from West Point, became famous after Carpenter called in an airstrike on his own position after getting surrounded. King of the Sky and I were in the air, slicing circles over Carpenter's position. He was trying to get to the old landing zone for us to take the company out. We listened to the communications reports and watched the drop zone, expecting to see soldiers. We can't get through to the zone, Carpenter reported. We're surrounded. Where are you? Gunner 6, Carpenter's commander, insisted. 100 meters east of the drop zone, Carpenter said quietly. The machine guns shouted over his voice. I only have 6 men with me. We're surrounded. Call for an airstrike now. On your position? Shooter 6 interjected. Yes, now. 2 Sky Raiders were already on the attack line. They instantly received the instructions and began bombing the coordinates. They dropped bombs mixed with shells and then machine guns. Smoke enveloped Carpenter's position. There was a long silence. We did it, came Carpenter's tired voice. They retreated. Gunner 6 spoke. Just in case, I want you to know that I'm presenting you for the Medal of Honor. No response. I also hope that when we get to you, we find a bunch of dead Viet Cong. So far, I only see my own, replied a quiet voice. Send help, said Rifleman 6. A few moments later, Rifleman 6 contacted us. He asked us to land at his position near the artillery installations. I don't understand, he began. He was sitting on the floor of the Huey, holding a laminated clipboard map. He looked grim and tired. He pointed to a circled dot on the green paper. I don't understand. They should be here. He was talking about the platoon he had tried to direct toward Carpenter's position. But the platoon didn't make it because when the soldiers made their way to the coordinates indicated, they found nothing and were surrounded by the enemy. Rifleman 6 was overwhelmed. He had calculated everything on his desk map, had placed all the markings correctly, but his soldiers proved otherwise. "I order you to go in search of this squad," he pointed to the map. "Find them and set their course here." He ran his finger across the map to Carpenter's position. The major and captain climbed into our cargo bay with a large radio. We took off. I walked slowly over the treetops, listening over the comms for instructions from the grunts. They could hear our helicopter. Taking advantage of the noise of the engines, they steered us straight toward their position. As we searched up and down over the jungle, the enemy didn't fire. But when I located the squadron and began circling above it, the enemies hit us from neighboring elevations. I heard a single Utes. I flew over the squad, made a U-turn and flew over them, indicating the exact course to the position they were to reach. "That's where you're going," the major sitting behind us said over the comms. The squad took his orders. The major sent us off to find another lost squad. Again, as we hovered back and forth over the jungle, right in front of a slope with enemy positions, no shots were fired at us. But as soon as I circled over the position, the enemy opened fire. The whole slope lit up with muzzle flashes. We were so close to one of the North Vietnamese soldiers firing positions that we could hear the crackle of scorching rifles. I felt a thud on the hull of the helicopter, turned around and saw the major lying on the floor. It was not a bullet that had driven him there, but an instinctive urge to throw himself to the ground during the shelling. It was somewhat amusing that the floor of the cargo bay seemed safe for him. The bullets pierced the belly of the vehicle like foil, but I didn't dare laugh. I turned and flew over the invisible soldiers in the direction they wanted me to go. As we crossed their position, the King of the Sky reported over the comms course 260. The lieutenant below accepted. That's how we flew, over and over again. In a couple of hours we had set the right courses for all the lost squads, or rather everyone who was still in contact. They flocked to the same position to join up. Rifleman 6 wasn't just planning to cover Carpenter's position, he wanted to get all of his soldiers together for the evacuation. He was fed up with this shit. It was time to call in the cavalry. We sat back down at Shooter 6's position and watched him try to explain his plans to the adjutants. The plan was to ask 1st Squad to send out at least a battalion of infantry and place them in positions on several ridges north of the battle. He figured that if the Air Force bombed the battle zone and the 101st made a quick attack, they would be able to drive the North Vietnamese soldiers toward the cavalry forces. This plan was insane, as Rifleman 6 assumed that the North Vietnamese soldiers would run through the highlands, not the valleys. Looking at the map, I saw thousands of escape routes for North Vietnamese soldiers, but again I was not an infantry commander, which made me very happy. The briefing was interesting, but right in the middle we were sent to rescue wounded soldiers. King Sky later confessed that he didn't believe we were successful. The landing zone was a narrow circle cut into the thickest part of a young stand of trees, and the grunts had loaded too many wounded aboard for us to hover. To top it all off, we were in a zone of constant fire. I pulled what could only be called a complete reckless move. The decision came on automatic. The car lost momentum in hovering 1 foot above the ground. I couldn't unload anyone. The wounded were dying, and we were surrounded by bushes and young trees 15 feet high, but we were on a hill. My instincts told me that if I could jump over this barrier, the car would spiral down the slope and we would pick up speed. So when the King of Heaven advised me to unload at least one wounded man, I shook my head and headed for the most fluid part of the hedge. Fortunately, the blades were so high above the ground that they caught only the thinnest of tree tops. The nose of the machine was tearing through branches and leaves. The skids were constantly snagging on something and the blades were digging into the wood. It sounded like we were crashing. The grunts were yelling in the cargo hold. But as we squeezed through the trees, leaves, and bushes with such difficulty, the ground beneath us broke sharply. The blades rose above the tops, and we dragged the fuselage through the remnants of vegetation. We burst out of the forest floor, raising a whole whirlpool of wood chips, just a turbocharged brush cutter. I sailed down the hillside, picked up airspeed, and took off up the hill. The King of Heaven uttered, "Holy shit!" I laughed. I was surprised myself. By the evening of that day, the scattered squads, platoons, and companies had grouped together at one point. It turned out Carpenter had lost fewer soldiers than he thought. Only half of his company was dead or wounded. The rest were scattered throughout the jungle. The jungle was an ally of our enemy, and as long as he forced us to fight in the clutches of vegetation, we were going to lose. By some miracle, Carpenter's heroic, suicidal decision had not earned him a scratch and stopped the enemy's onslaught. But we lost that battle. The grunts withdrew behind artillery positions to wait for the cavalry and air force. Whole squads of B-52 bombers flew from the Air Force Base in Guam, dropping 1,000-pound shells on the enemy. The bombs were supposed to wipe out a bunch of North Vietnamese soldiers. The survivors were supposed to throw themselves into the mountains, fleeing from the 101st, and the cavalry from the north were supposed to finish them off. The coverage area was too large. The delay caused by waiting for the Air Force was too long. Early the next day, Gary and I and the rest of the prospectors froze beside our helicopters in the company compound. From the southern part of the valley came the roar of a monstrous thunderstorm. The noise was so loud that we couldn't hear each other's voices. The thunderstorm took the form of a countless horde of cavalry helicopters. The cavalry raced toward the highlands, at least 80 vehicles at low altitude and high speed. The horde flew over us and continued northward toward their intended target. After a few minutes, the tail of their formation disappeared and there was silence. "Damn, I've never seen so many Hueys in the sky," someone said. I admit I felt proud at the sight of my old unit. They were the elite in this part of the world. That same day, the cavalry's reputation lost some of its luster. The 101st was engaged in scattered firefights in the impenetrable valleys. A company of cavalry attack helicopters was called in for backup. It was to support one of the ground commanders, who over the comms asked the cavalry to riddle an area with bullets where he would throw a yellow smoke grenade. Passing that zone, which the cavalry was to shell at the request of the 101st, was a radio operator with his squad. He had several smoke grenades hanging from his belt. One of them, of course, was yellow in color. At the very moment when the commander of the grunts, a mile away from the radio operator, reported that he had thrown the yellow smoke grenade, a random branch caught the yellow smoke grenade hanging on the radio operator's belt and pulled the pin. The radio operator and his platoon instantly disappeared in a puff of pale yellow smoke. Cavalry attack helicopters were just nearby, scouting out their target, marked by the yellow smoke. The attack helicopters reported seeing the smoke and opened fire. They even saw the soldiers running around the smoke and thought they had given the good old Charlies a thrashing. When the pawn commander realized that no one was firing on his yellow smoke, but was firing on the other yellow smoke, he yelled over the comms for the attack helicopters to cease fire. He did it just in time. In a matter of seconds, the helicopters had shot the radio squad leader and wounded 21 soldiers, including the radio operator. It was a stupid accident, but the cavalry were considered underdogs, especially after such a theatrical flight in formation. They'd ruined their reputation. The prospectors and the 101st felt more relaxed when they were convinced that the cavalry would be stuck in the mountains to the north, acting as an anvil. We were the hammer. The next day, all units of the 101st were pulled back to clear the bombing zone. The North Vietnamese soldiers were not idiots. They realized what we had in mind. They vaporized in the jungle. According to the several hundred marks that had been made in wax pencil on the map, the North Vietnamese soldiers were surrounded, and now it was left to chase them along the mountain range, northward, right into the clutches of the lumbering but mighty cavalry. The next morning the Air Force was to do its part in squeezing out the enemy. The King of the Skies and I were sent to drive a television crew over the dirt road that served as the western boundary of the bombing zone. Images of bombs exploding, and even such giant bombs, have tremendous propaganda value, it's no secret. The clouds plunged into the valley, covering the mountains. The King of Heaven and I nervously cruised 500 feet above the road. We had been assured several times that the Air Force never missed, that it was virtually impossible to get hit by an accidental bomb. We knew this was bullshit the Air Force misses, and very often. As the bombs hit, we made another U-turn, heading along the road. The hills a quarter-mile away began to smoke. The intersecting shock waves rumbled in the sperm-laden air and began to diverge in circles over the ground. The hilltops, thickly forested, were instantly exposed. The 1,000-pound bombs fell one after another, methodically and crushingly, flying past the ridges into the gorges, crashing into the hillsides in a visual staccato of overlapping explosions and tearing the ground to pieces. Behind us, the camera crew oohed and ahed. The destructive rain began on the opposite side of the valley from us and moved closer. Somewhere in the sky, 30,000 feet above the clouds, highly skilled bomber crews were dropping shells within the marked area. Charlie was to be turned into hamburger patties. After half an hour of such bombardment, the shells reached the road. The circles from the shock waves weren't just visible in the air, they were tangible. The car shook after each explosion. The shells flew directly onto the road, so I left the route. One bomb exploded in front of us over the road, and I was beginning to think that now we will be able to check who wins Huey or a 1,000-pound bomb, as suddenly the bombing stopped. Silence. The valley was enveloped in thick smoke, with only bare broken trees visible. The ground was covered with ash, huge charred craters gaping everywhere. It was simply impossible to survive in such a place. The end of the bombing was the signal for hordes of Hueys to fly into the area and drop off grunts all over the ragged valley surface. Our mission was accomplished, so I headed back to camp almost immediately. I was impressed. The camera crew was impressed. The grunts were impressed. The gooks, on the other hand, were not impressed. They disappeared. They did, however, leave behind a few stunned but unharmed fighters who were immediately taken prisoner, about 20 North Vietnamese soldiers. Now it was up to the cavalry. The cavalry scoured the mountain ranges and valleys for 2 days. Then they headed back toward the bombed-out valley. The net closed, but there were no fish inside. The dumb little barbarians escaped, showing a minimum of respect for the outstanding technology. They followed the principles of judo and bent, but did not break. But a bombardment is a bombardment, a battle is a battle, and many soldiers showed true heroism. The battle was an impressive one, even though it was lost. General Westmoreland personally flew in from Saigon to hand out medals. Captain Carpenter was given a Silver Star and transferred to Westmoreland's staff. By the end of June, I was quite worn out. It had been a very hard demobilization. I wish I had never known the end of my service. As the day drew near, only 50 days to go home, death began to seem more and more inevitable, as if I had run out of luck and could be shot at any moment. In the interval between the present second and the day of departure, that very sortie was waiting for me, perhaps the most ordinary short sortie of all, a random fire, and one little stray bullet piercing my forehead. The nights became hell. I kept twitching and waking up from unseen dangers, even under the sedatives Doc Da Vinci gave me. During the day, while flying, everything was fine. The ice business kept me relaxed, too. But when I wasn't flying a few hours break or a day off, I grew gloomy before my eyes. Looking around, I was convinced we had gotten into Vietnam for nothing. I even began to sympathize with the enemy, for which I was later ashamed. The local war one had been dragged into continued every day. I was part of that war. While in the air, I was operating at the limit of my capabilities. Like all pilots, I flew hot landing zones because in the thick of things the nebulous principles by which war is fought dissipated completely. War was throwing off everything superfluous, even me. Deacon finally allowed Gary and I to fly together, and our first mission together was to deliver supplies to a small detachment stuck in the jungle. To find them, we used off-course navigation, a method not taught in flight school. Monk told me about it. With standard heading, you have to make allowances for wind drift when you follow a set course, but you never know which way to look when you're approaching a target after a long flight. Wind drift correction is a theoretical calculation. Being on an actual flight path, you can drift either one way or the other, but how do you know which way the drift has occurred? When navigating off course, there is no allowance for wind drift. For a pre-calculated time, you follow the magnetic flight course laid out on the map, and on approach you already know to look ahead. We had no trouble finding the squadron. When we had lunch, a firefight broke out near the landing strip where we had dropped off the Republic of Vietnam soldiers on the very first day. Our troops were taking casualties and the soldiers needed ammunition. Gary and I were able to sneak into a tiny gap between trees on a mountain ledge. We had just enough room to squeeze the blades of the main rotor. The tail rotor was left hanging over the chasm. The grunts threw a few wounded aboard, and then the machine guns crackled and the soldiers waved their arms frantically at us, ordering us to get out. The only way to fly out of such a nook was backwards. Having released the nose and blades, it was necessary to press the right pedal and turn the machine around its axis so that the nose and tail swapped places, returning to the normal position. Which we did. At the field hospital, the medics took care of all the wounded in a matter of seconds. Gary and I flew back for the second batch. Shit. They told us this damn area was cleared weeks ago, Gary said, resentfully. I guess nobody warned Charlie about it, I said. That's true. The squad asked us to wait. A small firefight was going on the ground. I circled high above the valley, keeping out of range of small arms fire. From our orbit we could see smoke rising over the northern part of the valley, where we had flown in the morning. There was more smoke to the west. Units of the 101st were advancing in that direction. The Americans were deploying their forces over a vast tract of territory, but from the altitude it seemed tiny. The sea of jungle stretched for hundreds of miles in all directions, and with that cover you could go anywhere. All right, Prospector, we're clear. Roger, we're on our way, Gary said. Once out of orbit, I flew over the top of the hill, dropped behind it, and began to approach along the ravine that led to the mountain ledge. We had managed to grab a load of ammunition along the way, so we were struggling to hover at that altitude. I had to time the approach in such a way that I would lose the oblique blast on the approach to the ledge. When we were going about 30 miles per hour and had only 100 yards to go, the starboard gunner opened fire. He saw the muzzle flashes. 50 yards before the ledge, at the most dangerous part of the way, the grunt gunner started waving his hands at me to fly away. It was impossible to land. I kept flying. Already 3 people were jumping and waving their hands away from me. At the same moment, a shout came from the communications channel. Don't land. We're under heavy fire. It was the first time I was in a situation like this. Usually I had the option of flying over the landing zone if it was forbidden to land. But our area was on the side of a hill. There were gorge walls on either side, and I had nowhere to turn. There was only free space below us and behind us. I leveled the car to stop the approach. We couldn't hover, so the helicopter began to lose altitude. With its nose up and tail down, it slid to the bottom of the ravine. As we were falling, I pressed the right pedal and turned the nose to keep falling and gain airspeed. I pressed the throttle and tore into the gorge. The airspeed increased to 70. We turned from a falling craft to airborne again, and I sped between the trees on the ridge on the side of the gorge. The grunts saw us falling into the gorge. We disappeared around a corner, and they already thought we had crashed. But lo and behold, miracles. To their amazement, the Huey jumped out of the jungle. Eventually we made it to the ledge, unloaded our ammunition, and picked up the remaining wounded. As usual, on the return trip of the last approach, the bodies of dead soldiers flew with us. That evening I took Gary with me to get a shipment of ice.